It was Christmas Eve in Chicago. Snow drifted quietly, blanketing sidewalks and aging park benches in a soft white hush. The city shimmered with strings of lights, holiday carols playing faintly through outdoor speakers, people passing by with cups of cocoa and bags of brightly wrapped gifts. Everywhere felt alive, except for one quiet corner, where Ethan Carter sat alone. He wore a dark wool coat, polished leather shoes, and had his hair neatly trimmed, the look of a man who belonged to the world. But inside, he had long felt like an outsider to everything that mattered. From afar, one might mistake him for a diplomat or a man heading to a high-end holiday gala. In truth, Ethan was an urban architect, 32, responsible for reshaping entire city blocks with award-winning designs. Yet, to him, everything felt empty. He once had everything others envied: success, wealth, recognition. But on a night like this, when the world turned toward family and tradition, Ethan chose silence. No parties, no friends, not even a text from relatives. Years ago, he had distanced himself from them, or perhaps they had distanced themselves from him. He sat with his hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes following the falling snow but not truly seeing. It wasn't that he hated Christmas, he just no longer felt it belonged to him. The twinkling lights, the children's laughter, the distant chime of church bells, all of it seemed to belong to other people, people who had somewhere to go. He bowed his head, letting out a slow breath. Another year gone, another holiday that felt the same. Nothing had changed, nothing ever did. And just as he resigned himself to another quiet, forgettable night, a small voice rang out behind him. "Mister, do you want to have Christmas dinner with me and my mom?" Ethan startled. The small voice broke through the silence around him like a bell cutting through fog. He turned his head. Standing nearby was a little girl, no older than 4. She wore a faded pink coat with frayed cuffs, her light brown curls falling gently across her cheeks. Her wide, hazel eyes shimmered brightly. In her hand was a small paper bag, slightly crumpled, as if she'd been holding it for some time. Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. There was no adult nearby, just the girl and the falling snow. He opened his mouth to ask something, but the girl spoke again. "My name's Lila. We live just down the street. My mom makes the best roast chicken ever. But tonight, it's just us two. You should come eat with us." There was something disarming about the way she said it. So honest, so simple. Ethan was caught off guard. No small talk, no hidden motives, just a straightforward invitation. He gave a hesitant smile. "Thank you, but..." Before he could finish, Lila stepped forward and took his hand. Her fingers were tiny, warm against the winter chill. She tugged gently, barely a pull, but it was enough. Ethan, for reasons he couldn't quite name, let her lead him. They began to walk. Ethan felt as if he had stepped out of himself, following a child he'd never met. But he wasn't afraid. Her little coat brushed his leg as they moved along the snowy sidewalk. Passers-by glanced at them, some smiling, others whispering. Under the soft glow of open shop windows and holiday lights, Ethan sensed something shifting. A child had seen him, alone, invisible, and offered him a place at her table. No expectations, no strings. They turned onto a narrow side street, lined with warm lights and curtained windows. Ethan suddenly realized he was breathing easier, as though, in that one act of kindness, he had been handed the first real gift he'd received in years. The apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building, its facade adorned with a small wreath and a string of mismatched blinking lights. Leela bounced up the stairs, grinning back at Ethan as if they'd known each other forever. "We're here, Mr. Mispaitawada," she chirped, knocking with her tiny fist. The door opened before she could knock again. A woman, close to 30, stood in the doorway. Her pale blonde hair was loosely braided over one shoulder. She wore a worn-out sweater and faded jeans. In one hand, she held a grocery bag and a bunch of carrots still dusted with soil. She looked at Ethan with a moment of surprise. "Mom, this is the man I invited to dinner," Lila said proudly. The woman paused. Then her eyes softened. She stepped aside gently. "Come in." Ethan crossed the threshold. The apartment was small. peeling walls, scuffed wooden floors, but somehow it felt warmer than anywhere he'd been in months. The smell of roast chicken and fresh bread lingered in the air. On the modest table were 3 mismatched plastic plates and a single candle tilted in a glass cup for a holder. "I'm Claire," the woman said softly, handing him a towel. "Ethan," he replied. They shook hands briefly. Lila scrambled into her chair, her little legs swinging above the floor. "You sit here," she said, patting the seat across from her. Ethan obeyed, awkward but unable to look away from the homey scene before him. Claire set a plate of chicken and vegetables in front of him, then took her place beside her daughter. For a long moment, no one spoke. The candle crackled faintly, and the wall clock ticked above their heads. Then Lila smiled and said quietly, "Merry Christmas, mister." Claire offered a soft smile as well. Not polite, not forced, just real. Ethan replied, "Merry Christmas," his voice thick with something he hadn't felt in years. They ate slowly. There was no linen, no wine, no centerpiece, just food. Warm, simple, and shared. Ethan sat there, no longer feeling like a stranger. Dinner ended in a warm, comfortable silence. No music, no ringing phones, just the soft crackle of the candle and the occasional giggle from Lila as she told stories about her imaginary snowman friend named Sir Fluffy. After the dishes were done, Claire brewed 2 mugs of tea. It was the cheap, overly floral kind, but in that moment, Ethan found the aroma oddly comforting. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a fluffy blanket, cheeks still pink from excitement and dessert. Claire sat down across from him. She didn't speak at first, just ran her fingers around the rim of her cup, eyes fixed on the candlelight. Ethan didn't rush to fill the silence. It was the kind of quiet that didn't press, a silence that accepted. "She's everything to me," Clara said softly. "I had her when I was 21. Ethan gave a small nod. Claire continued, no hesitation in her tone. She had once studied education, dreamed of having her own classroom with paper stars on the ceiling. Then she met someone older, charming, said all the right things, and she believed him. That belief led to Lila. When she told her parents she was keeping the baby, they withdrew their support. She moved out 2 days later. "I waited for him to come back," she said. "He never did." Ethan tightened his grip around his tea. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a quiet, honest respect. "Do you ever get angry?" he asked, his voice low. "At life? At them?" Claire gave a soft laugh. "Not bitter, just tired." "Of course, but I learned early, anger eats more than it feeds. It doesn't fix what's broken." She smiled faintly. "No use blaming the weather. You just find a better coat." Ethan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That sentence stayed with him. He lifted his gaze. "My family's rich," he said. "Private jets, gala dinners, legacy buildings. But my mom hasn't hugged me since I was 10. My dad sees me as a failure because I wouldn't take over the company." Claire said nothing. She just listened. With her eyes, her stillness. Ethan kept going. "I started my own architecture firm at 18. Didn't talk to them for 3 years. They said I was arrogant. I said they were wrong. That was the end of it." Claire reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Light, but steady. "Maybe they love you," she said. "They just never learned how to show it." Ethan looked at her and something inside him softened. Not a solution, just a letting go. In that tiny kitchen, lit by a single flickering candle and filled with the scent of floral tea, Ethan felt, perhaps for the first time, seen. Not because he had to prove anything, but because someone chose to see him, just as he was. They sat across from each other, framed by the soft flicker of candlelight and the quiet scent of floral tea drifting through the air. Neither of them tried to fill the silence with idle words. Between them existed a rare kind of quiet, not awkward, not distant, but the silence of 2 people slowly beginning to understand one another. Claire, a single mother who had braved winter nights with a baby in her arms, intimately familiar with sacrifice. Ethan, a successful man who had walked through glittering rooms full of strangers, deeply familiar with being unseen. Two lives, worlds apart, yet now they shared the same table, the same warmth, the same ache of what had been missing. Perhaps it was loneliness that had drawn them together, not in desperation, but in recognition, a kind of still, honest presence. Every story shared left behind an echo, not out of pity, but out of quiet resonance, like recognizing your own reflection in someone else's pain. Ethan looked at Claire, not with the detached politeness of a guest, but with the quiet gaze of a soul who had found a mirror. Claire didn't flinch. She listened to him as though his wounds weren't foreign to her, but familiar. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, something had begun to stir, a shared feeling, the kind that grows not through grand declarations, but in stillness, between two hearts that have both been left behind and suddenly, gently, found each other. Ethan hadn't planned to return, but 2 days later he found himself standing at their door again, holding a box of pastries with no real explanation for why he was there. Claire looked surprised, but she didn't question it. She simply smiled and said, "Come on in." From that day, Ethan's visits became something familiar. Sometimes he brought donuts from the bakery Claire once mentioned she loved but couldn't often afford. Other times it was a picture book for Lila, filled with sweet illustrations he thought she might enjoy. And sometimes he brought nothing, just himself, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, listening to Lila talk about her imaginary dragon named Sparkle. He started noticing small things around the apartment, the flickering light in the kitchen, the loose cabinet handle. He said nothing, just came back with a new bulb, a screwdriver, and a small step stool. "Just returning the favor with my clumsy handyman skills," he joked. Claire always thanked him, but Ethan always waved it off. "I'm not doing this out of politeness," he said once, after helping her carry laundry up the stairs. "I'm doing it because I want to." They began to find their own rhythm. Conversations at the dinner table grew longer, easier. Lila started calling him our Ethan. No one corrected her. No one needed to. One snowy late afternoon, Ethan arrived with a small paper bag. Claire opened the door, surprised to see him during work hours. "You're going to catch a cold walking around in this weather," she said. Ethan smiled, brushing snow from his coat. "Worth it." He pulled something wrapped in cream-colored tissue paper from the bag. Claire unwrapped it slowly. A thick beige scarf with delicate stitching. She froze. This looks exactly like the one I lost on the train years ago." Ethan nodded. "You mentioned it once while folding laundry. You looked a little sad, then laughed and said it was silly to miss a scarf. But I remembered." Claire looked up, her throat tightening. "You actually remembered?" Ethan didn't look away. "I forget most things people say, but that, I didn't." She said nothing, just nodded slowly, trying to keep whatever was rising inside from spilling out. That scarf. It wasn't just a gift. It was a memory honored, a quiet act of care, a sign that she and her daughter were no longer just kindnesses in Ethan's life, but something real, something lasting. As Christmas approached, one quiet evening after Lila had fallen asleep, Claire and Ethan sat by the window, watching snow fall outside. In the dim light, Claire gave a soft laugh and pointed to the corner of the room where a tiny artificial tree stood, taped to the wall because its base had broken off. "She's never had a real tree," Claire said quietly. "I found this one at a thrift store. Lila loves it, thinks it's magic, but I know what's missing." Ethan didn't reply. He simply looked at the tree, its crooked paper stars and handmade ornaments swaying gently. Something inside him ached. The next morning, Ethan didn't come by. No message, no goodbye. Claire assumed he had work. She didn't ask. She had grown used to people leaving. But on Christmas morning, as Lila rushed to the window like she always did to check for snow, she suddenly shrieked with delight. "Mom, Mommy, come quick!" Claire ran into the living room, heart pounding, hair still tousled. But when she looked outside the apartment door, she froze. Sitting just beyond the threshold, nestled in the snow, was a real Christmas tree. Small, fresh, wrapped in white string lights and adorned with silver bells. A red scarf had been tied around its base like a blanket. At the top, a handmade gold paper star leaned slightly to one side. Below it were 3 neatly wrapped presents in brown paper and red string. Lila twirled in circles. "He came, Mommy. Santa really came." Claire knelt down and picked up a small envelope taped to one of the boxes. The handwriting was unmistakable. "For Lila, from your secret Santa." She didn't have to open it. She already knew. Standing in the morning chill, the faint sound of bells ringing down the hallway, Claire reached out and gently touched the tree's soft needles. For years, she had tried to create magic out of scraps, but this time, someone had created it for her. Quietly, gently, and for no other reason than love. It wasn't just the tree, not the gifts. It was the quiet care behind it all, the red scarf wrapped around the base, his scarf, the gold paper star, just like the ones Lila made with her crayons. Every detail whispered, "I see you, I remember." A feeling stirred in Claire's chest, one she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but also something softer, deeper. A gentle joy tangled with a quiet fear, because no one had ever cared for her like this before. Silently, without asking for anything, but meaning everything. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply reached out, fingers brushing the tree's cold needles, and let her heart open just a little more. March arrived with soft sunlight and puddles left by melted snow. In the small apartment bathed in brightness, Lila was counting down the days to her 5th birthday, her first real party. One evening, Claire quietly told Ethan, "This year, it's the first time I can afford a real cake." She smiled, both proud and shy. The first time she has friends to invite. And she picked her own princess dress. All week, Lila talked about one thing, how Uncle Ethan had promised to be the first to knock on the door that morning, bringing a surprise. "He pinky swore, Mommy," she said earnestly. Claire smiled, though worry stirred beneath her hope. Ethan had never broken a promise. But she had lived through too many disappointments to not feel afraid. 2 days before the party, Ethan was in a boardroom when his phone rang. A call from Toronto. The meeting with a major client had been moved to the morning of Lila's birthday, and the client would only meet in person. Ethan stared at the calendar, stunned. He didn't need to ask. This meeting couldn't be rescheduled. That night, he called Claire. His voice was low. "I might not make it back in time." Claire was quiet, then said gently, "You've already done more than we ever expected." But then, barely above a whisper, she added, "She's not waiting for gifts, Ethan. She's waiting for you." He hung up, but didn't sleep. Instead, he sat alone in a luxury hotel suite in downtown Toronto. On the table beside him sat a small velvet box containing a silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Lila and Mom, my true north." Sitting alone in his luxury hotel suite in the heart of Toronto, Ethan stared at the watch on his wrist. Every ticking second seemed to press tighter against his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about Lila. Tiny Lila, in her pale lavender princess dress, waiting by the window. He pictured her eyes, slowly dimming with disappointment, when someone else, not him, was the first to walk through the door. He imagined Claire, forcing a smile, hiding the letdown she knew too well. The thought made his throat tighten. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt like work was costing him something far greater than success. He had flown across countries for high-stakes deals, spoken to rooms full of powerful people, but never had his heart felt as empty as it did now. In that little apartment, at that mismatched table, between Lila's wild stories and Claire's quiet gaze, Ethan had found something he never knew he was missing: connection. No one asked him for anything, yet he wanted to be there, not out of duty, but because he cared. And the moment the thought crossed his mind, "I might miss this," he knew. He couldn't. Not this time. Not with them. He stared out the window at the glittering skyline. But inside, he felt nothing. "What am I doing here?" he murmured, "when everything I want is waiting somewhere else?" Without hesitation, he picked up the phone. "Rebook my flight. I'm going home." That afternoon, the little apartment buzzed with laughter. Strawberry cake, paper crowns, frosting-smeared fingers. But as the hours passed, Claire kept glancing at the clock. By early evening, when hope had nearly faded, the doorbell rang. Claire opened the door. Ethan stood there, windblown, breathless, a velvet box in hand. Lila screamed, "Uncle Ethan," and threw herself into his arms. Ethan knelt down and opened the deep blue velvet box, handing it to Lila. Her eyes widened, lighting up as if she'd just discovered treasure. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, engraved in soft, looping script. "Lila and Mom, my true north." Lila gasped. "You spelled my name right," she squealed, throwing her arms around Ethan in pure delight. He laughed softly, but his gaze quickly turned to Claire, still standing there, quiet, holding something unspoken in her chest. Ethan stepped forward and gently placed the box into her hands. Claire looked at the bracelet, not because it sparkled, but because of what it meant. The words engraved weren't just a gift for her daughter. They were an acknowledgement, a connection. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes glistened, not because of the bracelet's worth, but because the man standing in front of her had not only shown up, but had remembered and understood. His presence, timely, promised, real, had touched a place in her heart she thought had long been closed. He wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying to replace. He was simply there. And somehow, that made her heart feel warm again. That evening, after the party had ended, after the last of the tiny guests had gone home and Lila had fallen asleep on the sofa, her bracelet gently slipping down her wrist, Ethan remained. He sat quietly at the kitchen table, where the final candle burned low, as if reluctant to let the night end. Claire was in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly, silently. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just the kind of quiet that exists when something unspoken lingers between two people. Ethan lifted his gaze, then stood and walked toward her. He took a breath, steady and sure, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm sorry," he said, "for almost missing it, and for not always knowing where I belong." Claire turned, drying her hands on a towel. She looked at him with eyes softer than any reply. Ethan continued carefully, sincerely. "I'm not here out of politeness. I'm not trying to play hero or fill someone else's place. I'm here because this is the only place I've been able to breathe." He glanced toward the little chair at the table, the one Lila had proudly assigned him on his first visit. "If that seat is still open," he said, "I'd like to keep sitting in it, not just for holidays, but for good." Claire didn't speak right away. The room felt still, just the clock ticking and the quiet between them. Then she stepped closer, her voice gentle, sure. "That seat, it's never been filled by anyone else," she said. "It's always been waiting for you." Claire didn't say another word. She simply nodded, slow, steady, the kind of yes that needed no voice. But in that shared glance, everything was clear. There was need, there was warmth, and there was a quiet but fierce love growing between them, not born from grand declarations, but from showing up. In the space between words, they both understood. Neither of them was alone anymore. And that chair was no longer empty. For the first time, he didn't have to earn his place. It was already his, quietly, completely, and truly. 1 year had passed since that first snowy night, and now, in a small, sunlit apartment with golden light pouring through its windows each morning, Ethan, Claire, and Lila lived as a real family. The apartment wasn't big nor luxurious. The wooden floors creaked, and the cream-colored walls had peeling spots, but it was filled with the sound of piano keys every morning, a child's laughter, and loving conversations in the evenings. It was warm, and it was enough. Claire taught music part-time at the community center just a few blocks away. She returned to a dream she had once left behind, guiding children through music with a patience built from a heart once broken and now healing. Ethan, though still managing a thriving company, chose a flexible schedule, cutting unnecessary meetings, just so he could be home for dinner every day. He learned how to tie Lila's hair in the mornings, how to make bear-shaped pancakes that always looked crooked, and how to fix the leaky faucet without calling a plumber. Every time Lila proudly called him our Ethan, he couldn't help but laugh and feel his heart fuller than he ever thought possible. As the holiday season approached, Claire suggested a small Christmas dinner, but Ethan had another idea. Why don't we invite the people around us, those who don't have anywhere else to go? And so, one evening before Christmas, their tiny apartment became a shelter for quiet souls. The elderly lady from downstairs who lived alone, the widower who fed birds in the morning, the single mother who often asked Claire to watch her daughter. There were no silk tablecloths or crystal glasses, just candles, simple food, sincere laughter, and familiar, grateful eyes. Claire looked at Ethan in the middle of their small kitchen, sleeves rolled up helping her stir the greens, and realized she was no longer alone in anything. Then one day, Ethan brought it up out of the blue. "How would you and Lila feel about coming to dinner with my parents?" Claire was stunned. That simple question choked her up a little. For over 10 years, Ethan had never mentioned bringing anyone home. That part of his life had always been locked away, filled with cold expectations and loveless dining tables. "Are you sure?" Claire asked gently. "What if they're not ready?" Ethan held her hand. "They don't have to be ready. I am. And I want them to know who my family is." That dinner happened in a formal setting, but the atmosphere was no longer cold. Ethan's mother didn't say much, but quietly poured Claire a cup of tea. His father, usually distant, placed a small silver tin in front of Lila, filled with soft caramel candies. "It's her favorite kind," Claire whispered. Ethan just smiled. Not a grand reconciliation, but a beginning. And just like that, after all those years, the once cold dining table of his childhood began to warm again, because of the quiet but undeniable presence of the two people he loved most. That Christmas Eve, their little apartment lit up like a warm lantern. Twinkling lights wrapped around the tall tree standing proudly in the corner, decorated with colored paper, dried pine cones, stars cut by Layla's tiny hands, and a cardboard ornament shaped like a house with the scribbled words, "Our Home." Claire wore a deep red dress, her hair loosely tied back, cheeks flushed from greeting guests. Ethan manned the kitchen, wearing an apron, ladle in hand, looking every bit like the dad he had become. Their guests were neighbors, friends, people who had once been invited to dinner, had once received a smile from Claire or a hug from Lila. They weren't there out of politeness. They came because they loved the warmth of this home. Laughter rose with the scent of gingerbread and Christmas music. Lila twirled around the tree, bracelet jingling, humming to herself. From across the room, Claire's eyes found Ethan's, and his found hers, like nothing else in the world mattered. Then, when everyone had gathered, when the lights had dimmed slightly, Lila suddenly cried out, "Mom, look!" Claire turned. Ethan was kneeling beneath the Christmas tree, holding a small, simple box, but his eyes were full of light. "Claire," he said, his voice a little unsteady, "I used to think Christmas was about grand parties, expensive gifts, and cold handshakes." He paused for a breath, then continued, "But you and Lila, you gave me something I never thought I'd have, a real seat at the table, a place to return to, a home built not with bricks, but with warmth." Claire stood still. To her, the room faded into a blur, only him and his voice, and the way his words landed gently where her heart had long been guarded. "So," Ethan whispered, "will you give me a place by your side, always?" Claire didn't cry. She simply nodded, the softest, most certain nod of her life. Lila shouted with joy. She said yes. Mommy said yes. The room erupted in claps and jingling bells. Final scene, the three of them, Ethan, Claire, and Lila, stood hand in hand beneath the tree, bathed in soft light. Outside the window, snow began to fall, quiet and kind. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because in that moment, Everything that mattered was already there.